Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission here is to take the most complex historical moments, the most contested sources, and, well, the densest knowledge, and really distill the essential truth for you.
And today, we are opening a door that was sealed tight for 1,500 years. It's a door into a completely lost landscape of religious thought. We're diving into the Nag Hammadi Library, the discovery, the intrigue, the content. It's quite a story.
It really is. This find, unearthed in Egypt, almost 80 years ago now, it's not just some old papyri. It's like proof that early Christianity was, well, fundamentally different, more decentralized, fluid, sometimes radically different from the religion we know today.
Exactly. These texts gave us the primary source material for Gnosticism, a faith that was, banned, deliberately forgotten, really only known through the, frankly, hostile writings of its enemies.
But before we even get into the theological bombshells, we have to tackle the discovery story itself, right? Because that's a whole saga on its own.
Oh, absolutely. The sources.
Oh.
Well, they reveal a really complex narrative. The historical facts got buried almost immediately under rumor, black market dealings, and, frankly, some pretty dramatic legends.
So the story of how they were found is maybe just as intriguing as what's in them.
You could definitely say that. It sets the stage for everything that follows.
Okay, let's unpack this. Right, so the story that most people hear about the Nag Hammadi Library, or NHL as we might call it, it's spectacular. It's the version championed mostly by the scholar James M. Robinson, the guy who dedicated his life to getting these texts out there.
And it reads, like you said, almost like an Indiana Jones movie opening.
Okay, so set the scene for us.
We're near Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, specifically at the base of the Jabal al-Tarif cliff. It's this area just riddled with ancient tombs, the time, December 1945.
Right.
And the canonical story, Robinson's story, centers on an Egyptian farmer, Mohammed al-Saman, and his brothers. They're out digging for sabak.
Well, just to be clear, sabak isn't treasure, right? It's not gold.
No, not at all. It's basically fertilizer. Soft, rich soil, often from decomposed mud brick or, tomb debris. Peasants used it for their fields. So they weren't necessarily tomb raiding for ancient secrets.
They were just farming, essentially, trying to improve their crop.
Exactly. And while they're digging, Al-Sama hits something hard. Turns out it's a large, red earthenware jar. Now, in Robinson's telling, this is where it gets spooky. Al-Sama apparently hesitates. He's afraid the jar holds a jinn, a spirit. With common folklore.
Okay, the classic trapped spirit trope.
Right. But the hope of finding gold, because maybe it does hold gold, overcomes the fear. So he smashes the jar open with his mattock. No gold. Instead, they find 13 leather-bound papyrus books, codices, wrapped in linen, just sitting there. The only find of its kind ever.
Wow. Okay. But you said the story gets famous for other reasons.
Right. It's not just about finding the books. It's about two really dramatic, sensational details that got attached to the story almost right away.
Okay. Detail number one.
The burning. The ultimate nightmare for any historian. Muhammad Ali, one of the brothers, supposedly takes the codices home. His mother, Ahmad. Well, she finds some loose leaves, maybe a whole codex.
Oh, no. Don't tell me.
Yeah. She later admitted burning much of the papyrus for kindling, for her oven.
Ugh. Priceless ancient knowledge. Used to bake bread.
Exactly. That detail alone, the sheer horror of it, guaranteed the story would be told and retold. It's just too tragically ironic.
Okay, I feel sick. What's detail number two?
The blood feud. Because apparently, finding priceless ancient texts wasn't dramatic enough. The discoverers were reportedly involved in this bitter, ongoing family feud.
Seriously?
According to the canonical story, yeah. Shortly after finding the jar, Muhammad Ali and his brothers tracked down and murdered a man named Ahmed Ismail. They believed he was responsible for killing their father earlier.
Whoa, okay, that is heavy. So ancient texts and a revenge killing all happening around the same time.
That's the narrative. And this violence becomes really crucial for the popular story. It gives a reason, a justification for why the texts weren't immediately, handed over to scholars or protected.
Right, it explains the chaos, why they might have been hidden again or entrusted to a priest or just sort of forgotten about while the family dealt with the murder and the police. It explains why they ended up scattered on the black market.
Precisely. It provides a neat, albeit brutal, explanation for the delay and dispersal. But, and this is a big but, this is exactly where modern scholarship, people like Mark Goodacre, pump the brakes.
Okay. So Goodacre and others are saying this whole dramatic story might not be true.
They argue it's likely a 20th century legend, a confabulation, something cooked up, maybe unintentionally, maybe not, because it made for such a compelling narrative. driven by sensationalism.
So what's the evidence against it? Where does the story fall apart?
Well, consistency is a major problem. Robinson's story, as gripping as it is, leans really heavily on interviews done decades after 1945, primarily with Muhammad Ali, who, remember, was an illiterate farmer.
Okay. Decades later, memories fade, stories change.
Exactly. And if you look closely at Robinson's own published reports from the 70s and 80s,
Yeah.
the key details, they keep shifting.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Okay, take the number of people actually there at the discovery. In Robinson's 1977 account, just 2 brothers.
Okay.
By 1979, suddenly there's 7 people there.
7.
And then, just 2 years later, in another account, it jumps to 8 individuals.
Wow. So the head count keeps changing. That's not a great sign for accuracy.
Not really. And it's not just the people. The jar itself seems to grow over time.
What do you mean?
Early reports, probably more reliable, put the jar at maybe 60 centimeters high. Plausible.
Right, about 2 feet.
Then, in later popular retellings, it becomes almost a meter high. Okay, bigger. But then, in some versions, it inflates to an improbable 6 feet high.
6 feet. That's enormous. Like a sarcophagus.
Exactly. It becomes this almost mythical container. And the bigger and more miraculous the jar, the more precious the contents seem. It's a classic storytelling inflation.
It sounds like the details got shaped to fit the drama. And the main source, Muhammad Ali himself, maybe wasn't the most reliable witness.
Well, even Robinson eventually had to concede that Ali's testimony was likely contaminated by the leading questions interviewers asked him over the years. And Robinson admitted there were instances of not impeccable veracity on his part.
So Ali might have just been telling these Western academics what he thought they wanted to hear. Stories about gin, gold, blood feuds.
It's highly likely. It fits the pattern.
Okay, so if we set aside Robinson's dramatic, possibly flawed account, what's the alternative? Who else was there early on?
We have to turn to Jean Jaurès, a French scholar. He was actually in the Nag Hammadi area very shortly after the text first surfaced in the late 1940s, way before the story solidified into legend.
And Jaurès's approach was different.
Crucially, yes, unlike some later investigators, Jaurès didn't offer inducements, no money, no whiskey bribes, and he made a point of not asking leading questions about blood feuds or gin.
Interesting. So what did Jaurès conclude?
He basically dismissed the blood feud and the book-burning stories outright. He called them sensationalist tittle-tattle. That was just confusing the real picture.
So his version is?
Much simpler, much less dramatic, and probably, historians now think, much closer to the actual truth. Jaurès simply reported, several peasants, no one knew who, had found the manuscripts in a jar.
That's it? Just some anonymous peasants found some books?
Pretty much. A quiet, unremarkable discovery, not a violent melodrama involving revenge killings and tragic book burnings.
Okay, stepping back then. Why did the sensational story, the Robinson version, the one with the ignorant peasants burning priceless texts and the savage blood feuds, why did that version become the dominant one, the canonical one?
Well, this is where post-colonial theory offers a really powerful lens. That dramatic narrative, whether true or not, served a very useful function, particularly for the Western academics involved. It creates this stark contrast, right? On one hand, you have the Egyptian locals portrayed as superstitious, violent, ignorant, literally destroying priceless history by using it as kindling. Chaos.
Okay, I see where this is going.
And on the other hand,
Yeah.
you have the responsible, educated Western scholars, mostly European and American, who step in as the heroic rescuers. They save the text from this local chaos and ignorance.
So the dramatic story wasn't just a better story. It actually helped legitimize, well, the appropriation of the texts by Western scholarship. It framed it not as taking them, but as saving them.
Precisely. It provided a moral justification for removing these texts from their immediate Egyptian context and bringing them into the fold of Western academia. The act becomes preservation, not acquisition. Heroism, not colonialism.
Wow. So the story we all know and love, it's kind of an artifact itself, an artifact of 20th century academic politics maybe, and more than 4th century Egyptian reality.
That's a very good way to put it. The narrative became part of the history it was describing.
Okay, so regardless of how messy the discovery actually was, the artifacts themselves are just stunning. We're talking about 12 complete leather-bound papyrus codices plus bits of a 13th. And inside, 52 distinct writings, or tractates.
Right. And the format itself, the codex, is important. These are books, with pages you turn, not scrolls you unroll.
Which was relatively new tech back then.
Relatively, yeah, in the 4th century.
Yeah.
Christians adopted the Codex pretty quickly, partly because it was just easier for study. You could flip back and forth, cross-reference much more easily than with a scroll.
Makes sense.
But also there was likely a symbolic element. Using the Codex helped physically distinguish their sacred writings from the traditional Jewish scroll tradition and from pagan literature, which also often used scrolls.
Interesting. A technological choice with theological weight. No, what about the language? What are they written in?
They're written in Coptic. That's the final stage of the ancient Egyptian language,
Right.
written using mostly Greek letters. But, and this is absolutely critical, scholars are certain these are translations.
Translations from what?
From Greek. There's no question, as the sources say. The original works were composed in Greek. We know this from linguistic clues, sentence structures that only make sense in Greek.
Right.
And also because one of the codices, Codex 6, actually includes a chunk of Plato's Republic translated into Coptic, but originally, obviously, Greek philosophy.
So we've got texts originally written in Greek, probably in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE.
Right, likely in more elite urban philosophical circles.
And then copied down into Coptic, the local Egyptian language, in the 4th or maybe early 5th century. What does that time lag tell us?
It tells a fascinating story about cultural transmission,
Sure.
inculturation. What started as maybe an intellectually elite Greek-speaking movement was, by the time these books were buried, being adopted and translated for indigenous Coptic-speaking communities.
So probably monks.
Most likely, yeah. The area around Nag Hammadi was dense with monasteries. So these ideas, born in Greek philosophy and theology, were being democratized, localized, brought into the world of Egyptian monasticism.
Okay. But before anyone could translate them in the 20th century, they had to actually get hold of them. And you mentioned the black market.
Right. After the initial discovery, however it happened, the codices didn't stay together. They got dispersed pretty quickly onto the antiquities black market, moving from the peasants' hands to dealers, likely nearby towns, and eventually Cairo.
A familiar story with Egyptian finds, unfortunately.
Very. The bulk of the texts were eventually gathered up by a prominent Cypriot antiques dealer in Cairo, a guy named Fokion J. Tanos. He realized he had something major.
And this is where the authorities stepped in?
Yes. The Egyptian Department of Antiquities got wind of it and had to act fast. They scrambled to prevent Tanos from selling off the collection piece by piece, potentially scattering it across the globe permanently.
Did it succeed?
Mostly. They managed to acquire and secure the majority of the library for Egypt. However, one volume, Codex's First, did slip through the net. It was sold to a Belgian dealer, changed hands again, and eventually ended up in Zurich, Switzerland.
Oh.
It was acquired by the famous Jung Institute.
Carl Jung's Institute.
The very same, which is why it became known as the Jung Codex. There was a lot of interest there in Gnostic ideas naturally.
But it eventually came back to Egypt.
Yes, thankfully. After years of negotiation and scholarly collaboration, the Jung Codex was eventually repatriated. It was a huge deal, reuniting the entire collection.
So where is the library now?
Today, the complete Nag Hammadi Library is housed safely and permanently at the Coptic Museum in Old Cairo. Researchers can access the originals under strict conditions, but for most scholars around the world, the work is done using excellent digital facsimiles. They're accessible globally.
It's amazing they survived at all. But the real reason they survived wasn't the 20th century scramble, was it? It goes back much further.
Absolutely. The key is why they were buried in that jar in the first place. The dating points to around 390 CE, and that date is incredibly significant.
Why 390 CE?
Because it comes shortly after the consolidation of power by what we now call the proto-orthodox Christian movement. The watershed moment was 367 CE.
Okay, what happened in 367?
That was the year Athanasius, the very powerful bishop of Alexandria, issued his famous Easter festal letter. And in that letter, for the very first time, he laid down the law. He defined the 27 books, exactly the 27 books that constitute the New Testament canon we use today.
Right, the official list.
But he didn't just say what was in. He also explicitly ordered that all other books, anything considered apocryphal, which included exactly the kinds of secret gospels, revelations, and mythological texts found at Nag Hammadi, should be rejected. And not just rejected, but actively hunted down and destroyed, burned.
Wow. So the burial, it was an act of preservation.
It was an act of theological defiance.
Yeah.
The conclusion is almost inescapable. The owners of this library, almost certainly a nearby monastic community that valued these texts, perhaps a Gnostic-leaning one, were facing a direct threat from the increasingly powerful Orthodox Church.
They were hiding their sacred books from the book burners.
Exactly. They sealed their library in that jar and buried it, hoping to save it from the rising tide of orthodoxy. They were trying to protect their heretical scriptures.
So the 1945 discovery, It wasn't really a discovery, it was a resurrection.
That's a perfect way to put it. The accidental unearthing of a library that its own owners had deliberately hidden, essentially executing it to save it, 1,550 years earlier. It's an incredible historical time capsule created by religious persecution.
Okay, so the texts are resurrected. Now, getting them out to the world, that was another huge challenge, right? Led by James Robinson again.
Yes, Robinson, despite the issues with his discovery narrative, played an absolutely crucial role here. He spearheaded the massive international effort with UNESCO support to actually publish these fragile, difficult texts. It was a monumental academic and, frankly, political undertaking.
What were the main hurdles?
Well, the papyri were incredibly fragile, some literally crumbling. The Coptic dialect used was complex and not widely known, and you needed a way for scholars all over the world to access the same reliable version of the text to avoid errors and duplication of effort. Political tensions in the Middle East also complicated access at times.
So how did they tackle it? What was the process?
It happened in three main stages. First, and absolutely essentially, was creating the facsimile edition. This took years, from 1972 to 1977.
Facsimile, so like exact copies.
High-quality photographic copies of every single surviving page. These were compiled into 12 huge, expensive volumes.
Why was that so important?
Because it meant that any scholar, anywhere in the world, could finally see the original manuscript pages for themselves. They could begin the painstaking work of transcribing the Coptic text, checking each other's work, knowing they were all looking at the exact same source material. It democratized the initial access.
Okay, so transcription first, then came the translation.
Right. Stage 2 was the landmark publication.
Yeah.
The Nag Hammadi Library in English, which came out in 1977. This was the first time all 52 texts were available in a single volume, translated into English by a whole team of international experts coordinated by Robinson.
And that must have been huge.
It fundamentally changed everything. It effectively launched modern Gnostic studies as a serious academic field. Before that, scholars were mostly relying on those hostile accounts from the Church Fathers. Now, they had the Gnostics' own words, primary sources. It shifted the entire paradigm.
And there was a third stage?
Yes, a majorly revised edition of the English translation came out in 1988. It incorporated a full decade of further research, refined translations, corrected understandings of the Coptic dialects, added more scholarly notes. That 1988 edition is still pretty much the standard academic reference work we use today. So getting these texts published wasn't just about adding more ancient documents to the library shelves. It triggered really a theological revolution, because for the first time we could hear the voices of the losers of early Christian history.
You mean the Gnostics and other groups pushed aside by the proto-Orthodox?
Exactly. Think about the situation before 1945. For over 1,500 years, Gnosticism was basically a faith forgotten. Our only real information came from those fragmentary and, let's be honest, venomous attacks by the Church Fathers, the heresiologists.
Right, guys like Irenaeus, Tertullian. Their job was basically to debunk and condemn these other groups.
And they didn't just condemn, they actively vilified them. They painted Gnostics as this bizarre, depraved, sexually immoral cult that was deliberately twisting the true message of Jesus. They made them sound as alien and dangerous as possible.
So scholars were trying to reconstruct Gnostic beliefs based on these incredibly biased, hostile accounts, like trying to understand a political party only by reading attack ads from their opponents.
That's a perfect analogy. It was incredibly difficult and often misleading. But then Nag Hammadi gives us the Gnostics' own writings, their gospels, their prayers, their cosmology.
And what did they reveal?
They revealed that Gnostic Christianity was not the depraved cult described by Orthodox Christian writers.
Yeah.
Not at all. It was a legitimate religious movement, or rather, a diverse set of movements with complex, sophisticated, and deeply spiritual theological systems. Different, yes. Depraved, no.
And the biggest historical takeaway from all this?
It absolutely shattered the long-held myth of a single, unified, monolithic early Christianity.
Explain that. The traditional view was?
The traditional model, the one taught for centuries, assumed this pure, unbroken line of doctrine handed down directly from Jesus and the apostles. One true church, one true faith, right from the start. And anyone who deviated, like the Gnostics, was seen as a later corruption, a heretic who popped up after the truth was already established.
But the Nag Hammadi texts mess up that timeline.
Completely, because these texts date from the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century CE. They are contemporary with the formation of the New Testament writings themselves. They come from the exact period before there was an official canon or creed.
So instead of one true Christianity fighting off later heresies.
What the NHL reveals is an era of incredible theological ferment. There was no single, unified orthodoxy in the beginning. Instead, you had multiple, fluid, diverse, and often fiercely competing Christianities, all jostling for influence, all claiming to represent the true message of Jesus.
And the group we now call proto-Orthodox, the ones whose writings ended up in the New Testament, they were just one of those groups.
They were one stream among many. They just happened to be the stream that ultimately won the battle for definition. They standardized their beliefs with a fixed canon, formal creeds like the Nicene Creed, and crucially, they eventually got the political backing of the Roman Empire under Constantine and later emperors.
And that backing allowed them to suppress the competition?
It did. They could marginalize, condemn, and eventually outlaw their rivals like the Gnostics, whose books were buried at Nag Hammadi. History is written by the winners, and in this case, the winners also got to define what Christianity itself meant.
Okay, so fundamentally different groups. How different were their actual core beliefs about salvation?
They operated on completely different axes, really. Think about it like this. Proto-Orthodoxy, the winning stream, operates primarily on a sin and repentance axis.
Meaning
Meaning the core human problem is seen as moral rebellion against God, sin, disobedience. The solution, therefore, is forgiveness, which is achieved through faith in Jesus Christ and his atoning sacrifice on the cross. He pays the price for our sins.
Okay, sin, faith, forgiveness through Christ's death. That's familiar. What about the Gnostic axis?
Gnosticism operates on an illusion and enlightenment axis.
Illusion and enlightenment.
Yes. For Gnostics, the fundamental human problem isn't moral sin. It's metaphysical ignorance. We are ignorant of our true divine origin. We're trapped in an illusion about the nature of this material world. We've forgotten who we really are.
So the problem isn't that we're bad, it's that we're asleep or lost.
Exactly. And therefore, the solution isn't primarily about forgiveness for sin. It's about achieving gnosis.
Gnosis. That's the key term, right? What does it mean?
It's Greek for knowledge, but not just intellectual knowledge. It means a direct, personal, intuitive, transformative insight into your true nature and the true nature of reality. It's an awakening that liberates the divine spark within you from the prison of ignorance and the material world.
So it's less about believing the right things and more about knowing or experiencing something profound.
Precisely. It's salvation through enlightenment, not salvation through atonement in the orthodox sense.
That's a huge difference. And this difference extended to other areas too, like, say, gender.
Oh, absolutely. While proto-orthodoxy moved pretty quickly towards establishing a strictly hierarchical, exclusively male priesthood and emphasizing a purely masculine godhead, the Nag Hammadi texts often paint a very different picture.
How so?
They frequently embrace the feminine divine. You find these incredibly powerful female figures at the highest levels of the cosmos. Sophia, which means wisdom, is central. There's also Barbelo, often seen as the first emanation from the ultimate God, a kind of divine mother figure. Even the Holy Spirit is sometimes described using feminine grammar or imagery.
So a more balanced, maybe even androgynous view of the divine source.
Definitely less rigidly patriarchal than what became standard. And this respect for the feminine extended to human roles as well, particularly regarding women's authority.
You talking about Mary Magdalene?
She's the prime example. In the canonical Gospels, she's important, yes, but often overshadowed, sometimes depicted primarily as a repentant sinner. In many Nag Hammadi texts, though, she's elevated.
Elevated how?
She's portrayed as a spiritual leader. Jesus' most valued companion, the Greek word is koinonos, which implies partnership, equality. She's often shown understanding Jesus' deeper secret teachings when the male disciples, especially Peter, are confused or resistant.
So she's praised for her superior spiritual insight.
Consistently, these texts depict her as a primary recipient and interpreter of Jesus' gnosis. Her authority is presented as stemming directly from her connection to Jesus and her spiritual understanding, often putting her in direct, favorable contrast to Peter. It's a radically different portrayal. Right, so if the core problem is ignorance about our divine origin and the illusory nature of this world, where did this flawed world come from? This is where Gnosticism gets really wild. What's fascinating here is how they basically take the Genesis creation story and flip it completely on its head.
Okay, I'm ready. Where does the Gnostic universe begin?
It begins with the ultimate true divine, the source of everything real. They use various names: the monad, the one, the invisible spirit, the father, the depth.
And this being is?
Perfect, remote, utterly unknowable through normal means, uncorrupted. And crucially, this true God exists entirely outside the physical universe we inhabit. It's pure spirit beyond all flawed matter.
Okay, a perfect, unknowable source beyond our reality, then what?
From this perfect monad, there emanate a series of divine beings or principles, almost like ripples spreading out. These are called eons. They often come in male-female pairs, syzygy.
Eons, like
Yeah,
aspects of God.
sort of. They represent divine attributes or powers. Together, all these eons form the pleroma, which is Greek for fullness. The pleroma is the true spiritual heaven, the realm of the real God and his emanations. Think of it as the divine family, the totality of perfection.
Okay, so far so good. Perfect God, perfect spiritual heaven made of eons. Where does the trouble start?
The trouble, the cosmic crisis that leads to our flawed world, starts within the pleroma itself, with one specific eon, Sophia.
Is Sophia, that means wisdom, right?
Yes. She's often described as the youngest or outermost eon. And according to the myth, driven by some kind of passion, maybe a desire to understand the unknowable Father, maybe a flawed impulse, she tries to create something on her own, without the consent of her divine partner, and without the full power or permission of the monad.
Uh-oh. Unauthorized creation project.
Exactly. And because her act was unbalanced, premature, flawed, the result wasn't another perfect eon. Instead, she gives birth to something monstrous, deformed, incomplete.
Like a cosmic mistake, a miscarriage.
That's precisely the language some texts use, a cosmic miscarriage. The Apocryphon of John, for example, gives this vivid, almost grotesque description. The offspring has the body of a serpent and the head of a lion, with eyes like flashing fire. It's imperfect, arrogant, and fundamentally ignorant.
Yikes. So what does Sophia do with this creature?
Horrified and ashamed, she casts it out of the pleroma, hides it away in a lower realm, a cloud or a void, outside the perfect spiritual world. She essentially quarantines her mistake.
And this abandoned, flawed creature is...
This is the demiurge. The name means craftsman or artisan in Greek. But the Gnostics give him other names too, all highly negative, to emphasize his flaws. Yaldabaoth, Saklas, which means the fool in Aramaic.
Saklas the fool. Ouch.
And Samael, which means the blind god. Blindness and ignorance are his key characteristics.
Okay, so we have this flawed, blind, arrogant creator figure cast out of the true heaven. Now what?
Now comes the absolute core of the Gnostic heresy, the idea that just shocked the proto-Orthodox world. This demiurge, Yaldabaoth, isolated down in his lower realm, completely unaware of the perfect pleroma and the true God above him. He looks around, sees nothing higher than himself, and mistakenly, arrogantly believes he is the one and only God.
Wait, so the Gnostics are saying this flawed, ignorant demiurge, that's the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh.
Bingo, that's the bombshell. When the God of Genesis declares, I am God and there is no other, or I am a jealous God, the Gnostics read that not as the ultimate truth, but as the pathetic, ignorant boast of a lower blind deity who simply doesn't know any better. He literally can't see the true reality above him.
Wow, okay. That completely reframes everything. And it also deals with the problem of evil, doesn't it?
Exactly. The classic theological problem. If a perfect, all-powerful, all-good God created the world, why is it so full of suffering, decay, death, and injustice? The Orthodox answer involves free will, mystery, divine plans.
But the Gnostic answer is much simpler.
Much more direct. The true, perfect God didn't create this world. This flawed, messy, material universe where everything gets sick, dies, and falls apart is a botched job created by an imperfect, ignorant, maybe even malicious lower being. The flaws aren't a bug. They're a feature of the demiurge's own flawed nature.
So the world is inherently corrupt because its creator was corrupt. It's a prison, not a paradise.
A prison or tomb. That's common Gnostic imagery. And to help him manage this prison world, the demiurge, Yaldabaoth, creates his own helpers. He mimics the pleroma above by creating a host of beings called archons.
Archons, meaning rulers.
Yes. Think of them as cosmic bureaucrats, or maybe prison guards. They are the administrators of the material cosmos, the rulers of the planetary spheres. Their job is to help Yaldabaoth keep everything locked down.
Keep what locked down?
Us, humanity. Because when Yaldabaoth and the archons create the first human, Adam, based on a fate reflection of the true divine form they glimpsed from the pleroma, they make a crucial mistake.
What mistake?
They unwittingly trap something inside the physical body of Adam, a divine spark. Elements of the pleroma, fragments of Sophia's own divine essence that had trickled down into the lower realms.
So inside the physical body made by the flawed creator, there's a piece of the real God.
Precisely. That's the divine paradox of humanity and Gnosticism. We are these divine souls, sparks of the ultimate Godhead, trapped inside tombs of corrupt physical flesh, living in a flawed material world, ruled over by an ignorant, false God, the demiurge, and his archons.
That's a pretty bleak picture of the human condition.
It is, but it also holds the key to salvation. and it requires completely rereading Genesis. If the creator God, Yahweh Yaldabaoth, is the ignorant villain, then his commands must be wrong, right?
So the serpent in the Garden of Eden.
In many Gnostic texts, the serpent is actually the hero. It's often portrayed as a messenger, sent by the higher powers, maybe Sophia, maybe the true father, to enlighten Adam and Eve.
To give them the knowledge the demiurge forbade.
Exactly, to offer them Gnosis. The serpent tells them that if they eat from the tree of knowledge, their eyes will be opened, they will be like gods. And from the Gnostic perspective, that's not a lie, that's the truth. The demiurge forbade knowledge because he wanted to keep humanity ignorant and enslaved.
So the fall wasn't a fall into sin, it was the first step towards liberation, towards waking up.
Yes. It was the beginning of humanity reclaiming its divine potential, breaking free from the demiurge's prison of ignorance.
So if that's the problem, divine spark trapped in matter by an ignorant God, what's the Gnostic solution? What is salvation?
Salvation is the liberation of that divine spark, getting it out of the prison of the body, out of the flawed material world, ascending past the archons who guard the cosmic spheres, and returning finally to its true home, the pleroma, the realm of the true God.
And how do you achieve that?
Exclusively through Gnosis, through that direct, personal, transformative realization of who you really are, a divine being trapped in illusion, and understanding the true nature of the cosmos. It's an awakening.
And what's Christ's role in all this?
Christ's role is primarily didactic. He's seen as a divine messenger, an eon sent down from the pleroma, often bypassing the demiurge entirely. His mission isn't primarily to die for sins in the orthodox sense, but to teach, to bring the secret knowledge, the Gnosis, that awakens the trapped divine sparks within humanity and shows them the path back home. He comes to wake us up from the drunkenness or sleep of material existence.
Okay, that cosmology is a lot. It really turns things inside out. Let's look at some specific texts from Nag Hammadi that actually lay this stuff out. Where should we start?
The best place to start for the core myth is the Apocryphon of John, which translates as the Secret Book of John.
Why is that one so important?
Well, first, its sheer prevalence in the library tells us something. It was found in 3 separate codices. Codices 2, 3, and 4. Clearly, the people who buried this library considered it incredibly valuable. And content-wise, it's considered the foundational text for what scholars call classic Sethian Gnosticism, one of the major Gnostic schools.
Okay. And what's the format? How does it present this information?
It uses a common Gnostic literary device, the post-resurrection revelation dialogue. The risen Jesus appears privately to his disciple John, the son of Zebedee, after the ascension described in the New Testament, and imparts secret knowledge, the Gnosis, directly to them.
So it's framed as secret teachings from Jesus himself.
Exactly. And it lays out, in painstaking detail, that whole cosmological drama we just discussed. It gives the most elaborate source code for the myth. The description of the unknowable monad, the emanation of the divine feminine figure Barbello, the tragic fall of Sophia, the creation of that monstrous, arrogant demiurge Yaldabaoth, his boasting ignorance, the role of the archons, the flawed creation of the material world, and crucially, the trapping of the divine spark within Adam.
So if you want the Gnostic Genesis, the Apocryphon of John is the place to go.
It's the most complete narrative version we have of that core Sethian myth, definitely.
Okay, what's next? What about the text everyone's heard of?
Ah, you mean the Gospel of Thomas. Yes, that's arguably the most famous and certainly one of the most debated texts in the whole collection. Scholars often call it almost certainly the most important gospel not in the New Testament.
Why is it considered so important, and why is it so different?
It's radical mainly because of its structure. Unlike Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, Thomas has absolutely no narrative framework. There's no story of Jesus' birth, no miracles, really, no plot of his ministry, no trial, no crucifixion, no dramatic resurrection scene, nothing.
So, what is it then?
It's purely a collection of sayings, 114 secret sayings that the text claims the living Jesus spoke.
Secret sayings. And the premise is?
The premise is pure Gnosis. The very first saying sets the tone. Whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death. Eternal life comes not from believing in an event, but from understanding the secret meaning of Jesus' words. It puts the burden of salvation on interpretation, on knowledge.
Interpretation, not just faith.
Right. And many of the sayings themselves are deeply mystical, often pointing towards this idea of an immanent divinity, something found within yourself and within the world, rather than a distant sky god.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. We mentioned saying 3 earlier. The Father's imperial rule is inside you and outside you. When you know yourselves, then you will be known. That's a direct call to self-knowledge as the path to knowing God. The kingdom isn't up there. It's within and all around, accessible through the gnosis of the self.
Okay. Inner divinity.
And then there's say in 7c7, which is incredibly striking. Jesus says, split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift the stone, and you will find me there.
Wow. So Christ isn't just a person, he's present in the very fabric of the material world, even though the world itself is flawed.
That seems to be the implication. It suggests a kind of pantheistic or panentheistic view, the divine spark permeating all things, waiting to be discovered. It resonates strongly with the Gnostic idea of finding the light hidden within the darkness of matter.
Now, you said Thomas is debated. What's the big debate about?
It boils down to dating independence. Many sayings in Thomas have parallels in the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke. So the huge question is Thomas a later text, maybe 2nd century, that borrowed these sayings from the canonicals and just added a Gnostic spin?
That's one possibility.
Or, and this is the more radical theory, is Thomas, or at least the collection of sayings it's based on, actually earlier than the canonical narrative Gospels? Could it represent one of the very first ways Jesus' teachings were written down, just as a list of wisdom sayings, before they got embedded in a life story?
If that's true, that would mean the narrative gospel wasn't the only or even the earliest format for Christian scripture.
Exactly. It would challenge the assumption that the story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection was always the central focus. Maybe early on for some communities, the focus was simply on his mystical teachings, his sayings. It complicates the picture of Christian origins immensely.
Okay, let's move to another gospel, one that sounds intriguing. The Gospel of Philip. What's that one about?
Philip is different again. It's generally considered Valentinian. Gnostic Valentinus was another major Gnostic teacher whose system was perhaps a bit more philosophically refined, less mythologically stark than the Sethian stuff in Apocryphon of John.
And what's the focus in Philip?
It's less a narrative or sayings collection, and more like a series of theological reflections, aphorisms, and mystical interpretations of Christian rituals. It reads almost like notes for a Gnostic sacramental theology class. It talks about baptism, anointing, chrism, the Eucharist, but give them all a Gnostic spin.
And it's famous for one particular ritual or symbol, right?
Yes, the bridal chamber,
Yeah.
or nymphon in Greek. This is the most distinctive and often misunderstood element in Philip.
Misunderstood how? Did people think it was about literal sex ritual?
Exactly. Opponents of Gnosticism certainly jumped on that interpretation to accuse them of licentiousness. But scholars are pretty clear now that the bridal chamber is a profound mystical symbol, not necessarily a literal rite involving sex.
So what does it symbolize?
It symbolizes the ultimate goal of Gnostic salvation, reunification. Specifically, the spiritual marriage or reunion of the individual Gnostic soul with its divine counterpart, its angel or true self, that remained in the pleroma when the spark fell into matter.
Ah, so reuniting the divided self, restoring the original spiritual wholeness.
Precisely. The bridal chamber represents the mystical state or ritual context where the Gnostic achieves that perfect integration, that return to the androgynous unity of the pleroma, overcoming the separation caused by Sophia's fall and the creation of the material world. It's about becoming whole again, spiritually.
And Philip also talks about Mary Magdalene.
Yes, it's another key text for her prominence. Philip is the gospel that explicitly calls Mary Jesus' companion again, that Greek word koinos, and it contains the famous debated line about Jesus kissing her often, possibly on the mouth, which makes the other disciples jealous or confused.
And that word koinounos, it implies more than just friend.
It implies partnership, fellowship, sharing. In the context of the time, calling a woman Jesus' koinounos elevates her status significantly. It suggests a deep spiritual intimacy and equality, setting her apart from and perhaps above the other disciples in her connection to Jesus, again, reinforcing her role as a key recipient of his wisdom.
Okay, one more key text, the Gospel of Truth. Who wrote this one?
It's widely attributed, based on style and theology, to Valentinus himself, the founder of Valentinian Gnosticism. If so, it's incredibly important as a direct work by one of the most influential Gnostic thinkers of the 2nd century.
And what kind of text is it? Another gospel?
Not really a gospel in the narrative or saying sense. It's more like a beautiful, poetic, mystical sermon or homily. It reflects on the nature of ignorance, error, and the salvation brought by Christ's revelation of Gnosis.
Does it have the same elaborate mythology as the Apocryphon of John, Yaldabaoth, and Sophia?
No, it's much more abstract, more philosophical, almost psychological. It talks about the origin of the material world not through a cosmic battle, but through concepts like error, plain in Greek, forgetfulness, and ignorance of the Father.
So the world exists because of a mistake, a fog of ignorance.
That's the imagery. Error, born from ignorance of the Father, grew dense like a fog, and in its emptiness it labored to create a substitute for the truth, which is the material world. The world is fundamentally unreal, a product of collective metaphysical forgetfulness.
That sounds pretty bleak again. How does salvation work in this view?
Salvation comes through Christ, who is presented as the truth itself. He descends to shed light on those who are in darkness because of forgetfulness. He reveals the Father. Salvation, therefore, is defined as the acquaintance with the Father, achieving Gnosis.
And what happens when you achieve this Gnosis, this acquaintance with the truth?
The ending is stark. When truth Gnosis arrives, error, the material world, the state of ignorance, is shown to be utterly empty with nothing inside of her. It dissolves. It's revealed as the illusion it always was. There's no compromise here. Gnosis doesn't fix the world. It obliterates the illusion entirely by revealing the true reality. It's radical metaphysical dualism.
Okay, this is crucial context. We've mentioned the Nag Hammadi Library was found in 1945. Just a year or two later, another massive manuscript discovery happened not too far away, relatively speaking. The Dead Sea Scrolls. People often confuse them, right?
Constantly. And it's understandable. Two of the most monumental archaeological manuscript finds of the 20th century, unearthed almost simultaneously in the same region of the world. But culturally, linguistically, theologically,
Right.
they represent strikingly different worlds.
So let's break down the key differences. Content first. What's in the Dead Sea Scrolls versus Nag Hammadi?
Okay, Nag Hammadi Library, NHL, it's Gnostic Christian material. Secret Gospels like Thomas and Philip, complex mythological texts like Apocrypha of John, philosophical treatises, apocalypses revealing Gnosis, all firmly within a framework interpreting Jesus through a Gnostic lens.
And the Dead Sea Scrolls, DSS.
Completely different. The DSS are Jewish texts from the Second Temple period. They contain our oldest known manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. They also have other Jewish religious texts from the period like commentaries, apocalypses, wisdom literature, and important sectarian documents that describe the rules of beliefs of the specific community that lived at Qumran, likely the Essenes.
So Gnostic Christian versus Second Temple Jewish. Big difference already. What about language?
NHL.
Yeah.
Written in Coptic, but they were translations from Greek originals, composed mostly in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE.
DSS.
Overwhelmingly written in Hebrew and Aramaic, the Jewish languages of the time. There are a few fragments in Greek, but the vast majority are Semitic. Different language family, different cultural sphere.
Okay, and the physical format and date.
NHL. These are codices books with bound pages dating mostly from the 4th century CE.
DSS.
These are scrolls, mostly parchment, and some papyrus, dating much earlier from about the 3rd century BCE up to the 1st century CE, before the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE.
And you mentioned earlier the codex format itself was significant for Christians.
Yes. The fact that the NHL texts are in codices, a format Christians were adopting partly to distinguish themselves, while the DSS are scrolls, the traditional Jewish format for sacred texts, visually underscores the cultural divide. The very form of the NHL books marks them as part of the emerging, albeit diverse, Christian world of the 4th century.
But beyond content, language, and format, the biggest difference is theological, isn't it? You called it the unthinkable divide.
Absolutely. This is the chasm that truly separates these two libraries. The authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, likely Essenes, were deeply fundamentally rooted in the strict monotheism of the Hebrew Bible. Meaning for them, Yahweh, the God of Israel, God described in the Old Testament, was the one true, supreme, sovereign, and good God who created the heavens and the earth. Their entire religious life revolved around purity, adherence to the law, and obedience to this one God.
Okay. Standard Jewish monotheism of the time and the Nag Hammadi view.
As we've seen, the central Gnostic view expressed in many NHL texts is the polar opposite. It's the shocking assertion that the God of the Old Testament, the creator of the material world, is not the true ultimate God, but is actually a lower, flawed, ignorant, or even malevolent demiurge Yaldabaoth, Sakal is the blind god.
So one group worships the creator God of Genesis. The other group vilifies him as an ignorant fool or worse.
Precisely. The core Gnostic idea that the God who said, "I am God and there is no other," was simply wrong and ignorant would have been utterly, profoundly unthinkable, blasphemous, and horrifying to the Jewish community that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's simply no common ground there on the nature of the Creator.
So these two nearly contemporary discoveries give us snapshots of two radically different religious responses emerging in that ancient Near Eastern world. One doubling down on traditional monotheism, the other radically rejecting the traditional creator.
Exactly. They perfectly illustrate the incredible religious diversity and theological tension of the period. They show just how many different paths people were exploring in the centuries around the turn of the eras. Hashtag tag outro.
So wrapping this up, whether the Nag Hammadi Library was found amidst a blood feud or just quietly dug up by some peasants, the texts themselves have completely reshaped our understanding of early religious history, haven't they?
Irrevocably. The sensational discovery story is, as we discussed, probably more legend than fact, maybe a legend that served a purpose for Western academia. That mystery is part of the allure, sure, but the real legacy isn't the maybe discovery story.
The real legacy is the content, those 52 tractates.
Right. These are the primary sources, the actual writings
Yeah.
of a whole branch of Christian thought that was deliberately suppressed and almost entirely lost. They were buried for protection, resurrected by chance, and they provide undeniable proof that the early church wasn't this single, unified block we used to imagine.
It shatters that myth of monolithic origins.
Completely. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, what the NHL really reveals is that the first few centuries CE were this dynamic, messy period of intense debate, defined by these competing Christianities. The Gnostic library shows us a profoundly different path, one not focused on sin, obedience, and faith in an external atonement,
But
on self-knowledge, on enlightenment gnosis, on the radical, maybe terrifying, maybe liberating realization that our true selves are divine sparks trapped in a material world that's fundamentally flawed, maybe even created by a false god. It's a completely different map of reality.
so what does this all mean for us today? Why should we care about these ancient heretical texts?
Well, I think it forces us to accept the complexity, the messiness, the sheer diversity of religious origins.
Yeah.
It makes us question what Christianity even meant before it got standardized in the 4th century and beyond. It reminds us that the tradition we have today is, in many ways, simply the version that won out, the lineage that survived after actively suppressing its rivals.
It challenges the idea of a single, pure, unchanging truth handed down from the beginning.
It absolutely does. Which leads to a really provocative final thought, something for you, the listener, to consider. If the real history of early Christianity wasn't about transmitting one pure truth, but was actually defined by this vibrant, sometimes conflict-ridden battle between multiple fluid Christianities, what does that fluidity, that initial diversity, tell us about how we define religious boundaries, authority, even the concept of heresy today?
Yeah. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other versions, how many other Christianities might still be buried out there, metaphorically or literally, waiting to be rediscovered?